Many people are wondering if their home is a target in a nuclear war. Few people actually understand what the real threat to them is. And there's a lot of misinformation out there on what nuclear targets are and what the effect on the targets will be. This has led a lot of people to despair when they consider the topic of nuclear war when they shouldn't. A lot of people will die simply because fear has left them unprepared. I did write a book, Nuclear Survival in the Suburbs, on this topic, which is extensively researched using information, including things that are up to date, not just the outdated Cold War era manuals. What we look at here is how an average American who lives in a suburban single family dwelling can actually survive a nuclear war, and they don't have to simply go up on the roof and watch the explosion and hope to die or suffer from radiation sickness. It actually is viable to survive in your own home in certain cases, as we'll see. Now, what we have coming up is an old map. This is a fallout map prepared, believe, by one of the larger publications, Time Magazine or something like that, in the 1960s. This is showing city targets that would have been hit and the expected fallout. Now, again, this is a map of fallout, not targets, but you can see from the major metropolitan areas the fallout plumes blowing across the country along the prevailing wind directions. This map is not realistic, and I don't think it was realistic back then. But of course, the press has to scare people, even back in the 60s, so this is an absolute worst case scenario. Why isn't this realistic? Well, when cities are hit, they use airbursts, and this has been going on since we dropped the first one on Hiroshima. Airbursts produce very little to no fallout because they explode over the city, and there's simply no material in the middle of the sky unless you're an unlucky bird or plane to become fallout. So, if you see this map, don't take it as gospel truth and freak out. This isn't realistic, and it's not accurate for today. You may have also seen this map. This is from an online source, I forget where, but we've all seen it. It's a commercial product. It's based on a lot of the same assumptions I've made. It shows two scenarios, 2,000 warheads, which is close to the total deployed warheads that Russia and the United States have, which is about 1,900. But that's across ICBMs, submarine-launched missiles, and conventional air-launched weapons. So it's not everything that would be thrown at us. The 500 warhead scenario is more realistic, probably closer to 600 or 750, less if it's the Chinese. But it gives you an idea of what might be hit. Military bases and nuclear missile silos clustered at in the Midwest towards the top in the big clusters, the blobs of black dots. From there, larger cities are hit. I think this is goes a little overboard when it shows all the different cities. I don't think a lot of these places will be hit, only the really big metro areas. But again, it's a better representation of the strategies that we're looking at. The first strategy, say the 500 warhead scenario, it's called counter value. Counter value strikes basically hold the population centers hostage. You start a nuclear war with us, well, we'll nuke, kill your civilians. The idea is that no politician would be stupid enough to do that because then they won't get any votes or tax money if their people are dead. Well, we kind of know how our government works, so I don't think that's a good deterrent anymore. In the other scenario, the 2,000 warheads is what's called counterforce, nukes against military. From what I understand, that is the American military strategy. We prefer to take out the nuclear launching facilities, be they land, sea, or air-based, before they can strike us. Who knows if that's going to work? Probably in any case, the missiles will fall on recently vacated silos. We'll just be nuking empty holes on both sides, which is sort of why the Russians don't hold to that theory. From what I understand, the Russians don't use the counterforce theory as part of their planning. It's all counter value, nuking civilians. It's easier to do. You don't have to worry about a city being suddenly emptied because you launched your missiles too late. I think it does have, or should have, deterrent value, but then again, I'm not in charge. The counter value scenario is more frightening because it is against population centers. It's going to affect more people, and it's something that we need to realistically plan for. This is something that is definitely in China's playbook, because last I saw, the most reliable reports had them at only about 300 nuclear weapons. Probably going to have more by the time any potential nuclear war with China would happen. But with fewer weapons, they have to maximize the use of what they do have. So they're getting more bang for their buck by targeting major cities, probably more towards the West Coast. They're not launching strictly against military facilities. And as we'll see a little bit of, there are plenty of military bases right nestled in population centers. So saying they're only going to hit military bases is not any comfort. And if you look at the fallout map, only hitting nuclear missile silos isn't much comfort to the people in the Dakotas or Nebraska or in the Rockies. What we're looking at here is the port of LA and Long Beach. This is one of the busiest ports in the country, if not the world. I would personally hit this with cruise missiles, scuttling ships, different tactics at the beginning of a Pacific War to knock out our ability to rapidly resupply, and it would also totally devastate our economy. But when it comes to nuclear war, this is also a very valid target. I'm looking at this because it fits into the scenarios of my fictional nuclear war scenarios in Limited Exchange and Late for Doomsday 1 and 2, where port facilities are nuked by China. You would use nukes for a couple reasons. One of them being the size of the port. You're not going to be able to project power across the ocean to somehow damage this area and the extent of the facilities very well without using massive weapons. You could do it with a mass cruise missile attack, maybe launched out of disguised containers on a fake cargo ship. But the Chinese Navy does not have the ability to come close to our shores and attack these ports. But if you're going with nukes, you might as well just nuke it and make sure that the city isn't going to be easily rebuilt or resupplied, or the port facility would be prioritized for decontamination and rebuilding to be used for whatever purposes. It's really a low blow in war, but it makes sure that your enemy is basically kneecapped if he can't ship his goods. So why would you nuke a port in the first place? Well, to break stuff, of course. A nuclear weapon is just a very large explosion, whether you set it off at ground level or above ground. It's going to destroy any ships in the harbor. It's going to destroy all the facilities around it, even the approaching bridges to it. And the cargo handling facilities, the cranes, are going to be blown apart very easily. And even if you've used cruise missiles on it before, early in the war, those things can still be rebuilt. There are ways of getting around loading cargo ships. I mean, we can use portable cranes if we have to get the thing operating to fight a war. So you have to physically contaminate the land and break an infrastructure so badly that any expedients to try and get around the damage are defeated or delayed long enough that the goals of the attack can be met other ways. Here we're using Alex Wellerstein's nuke map tool to simulate an attack on the port. What I've chosen here is a surface or near surface level burst for fallout. Again, fallout only occurs when you have a nuclear weapon detonate at low altitude, at, near, or below ground. It has to get material from the surface of the earth into the fireball to create fallout. So here, I don't know what the actual scenarios or planning is on anybody's side, but I chose this scenario simply for the purposes of making this video and creating fallout. In the very center, you can see the dark spot, which is the crater. It's not really an issue here. But outside of that, you have a ring of 200 psi damage, which will destroy anything basically except concrete, like a brick of concrete or the ground itself. Okay, any structure is demolished. Beyond that, that outer red ring is going to be destruction of basically any standing structure. The only thing that might survive are metal or wooden piers. The Vincent Thomas Bridge up in the upper left corner probably only have its towers standing. The bridge deck would be ripped off completely. So everything around the port would be absolutely torn up. And that would still happen with an airburst, just depending on different factors of how and where they set it off. But I also chose this because this maximizes radiation, both in terms of fallout and prompt radiation. Prompt radiation is what you're seeing there in green. That's the area beneath the nuclear explosion that has been irradiated. This is what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, directly underneath the bomb. Ground zero today is still very slightly more radioactive than the area around it. What this does is it's sort of like a sunburn of radiation for the ground, in the sense that this is something that's been exposed to the nuclear reaction, and the material below it has become irradiated. This isn't like fallout, nothing's getting sucked up, but it's too near the blast, so it absorbs these rays. The most intense area is going to be in the very center, of course, and then it's going to reduce in intensity as it moves out. The reaction is spherical, of course, which is represented in 2 dimensions on the ground by a circle. In this case, the green circle, the edge of it rather, indicates 100 rem per hour. That's the initial level of contamination. Now imagine you're a dock worker and somehow miraculously they want you to come down there to work at the cleared port. You think you're going to work at a radioactive dock? I don't think so. The only people who are really going to be going down there to do anything while the radiation has any significant level are going to be emergency workers, and probably then they won't even be conducting rescues. Radiation does decrease over time. There's a rule of 7/10, so for every 7-fold passage of time, radiation decreases by 1/10. So every 7/7 for 7 hours, it goes down to 10% of what it was to begin with. After another period of 7 hours, so 49 hours, it's gone down to approximately 1% of what it was initially. But if you're getting 1 rem per hour, and it's going to take another 2 weeks for it to go down to negligible, in a 40-hour work week, that's 40 rem. That's enough to make you temporarily sterile and dramatically increase your chance of cancer. How many people are going to go to work and do that? So this port is out of action for a while, probably months to years. But now what about the fallout? As you can see here, if you live in Long Beach or San Pedro, pretty much anywhere in the South Bay area, you're screwed. Again, this plume that you're seeing here, this is an idealized plume. It's not actually going to look like that, just it's a rough distribution. It's going to be more blobular and have sort of an S shape to it, because there is going to be changing wind directions. There's going to be microclimates that are going to affect it as it begins to get downrange. But it's going to be quite powerful, going out quite a distance. And this isn't a very large nuke. So that's something to consider if you live near any potential ground burst targets. I think it's hard to predict the wind. It's hard to predict what anybody's actually going to do in these scenarios. Basically, what I would do is just extrapolate a ring based on the distances that you see here on the idealized plume, on what the potential risk for the areas within that range based on the average prevailing wind speed is going to be. And then if there is a nuclear crisis, just pay attention to the weather the day it happens. Maybe write down what you should expect what your prevailing wind speeds and directions are, so you can sort of guesstimate your own weather forecast in the absence of any products from the Weather Service. And I'm aware that I said that they aren't going to be using ground bursts on cities, on population centers. This is an exception. Again, I don't know if this is accurate, if they would actually use a surface burst on a port, but it worked for my book. Like I said, they're going to be using air bursts on most cities. Here we see downtown Los Angeles. It's not the home of the homeless. That's actually in Santa Monica, not San Francisco. But what we have here in LA is your typical major city. This is your downtown core. Further out, you're going to be getting into essentially not the suburbs, but suburban style homes, urban homes, and then you will get into the actual suburbs. Beyond that, the disconnected cities are actually exurbs, but I digress. If you live in a city like this or near it, anywhere within the major urban core, you are not in a good position. The strategy with counter value, nuking population centers, is to stomp the cities flat and kill as many people as possible. So they want to hit the big areas. Some of you, probably a lot of my readers, are in more rural areas, well away from things, so you're probably safe there, unless you live downwind of some major fallout targets. But again, if you are like most of Americans who live in urban areas, especially the big urban areas like this, you got some serious problems and considerations to make. The closer you are to a downtown area, the more danger you're in. We'll take a look at a western city. It's a good representation of more compact areas versus the stretched out nature of LA. But you really have to consider how close you are to a dense area and if it makes sense for that area to basically be carpet nuked until it's flat. So I would say, based on looking at the areas that we're going to look at, if you live in, it doesn't have to be a big city, but a big metro area, you are at risk. And you can't exactly predict that, okay, well, they're going to nuke, downtown LA and Orange County, but I'm going to be safe up here in Porter Ranch. Okay, you might be safe up in Porter Ranch until your windows get blown in from the 300 megaton warhead detonating somewhere over, I don't know, call it the Northridge Mall. You should really look these places up if you don't know what I'm talking about. But again, I digress. So let's look at what the counter value strategy on Los Angeles might look like. So now we're looking at LA, and I'm going to go ahead and drop some nukes on the city. As you can see here, the homeless problem in downtown LA has just been solved. That big gray dot in the center of these explosions that you're seeing are the maximum destruction. These are basically going to flatten houses, not necessarily down to the foundation in every case, but it's going to look like a F5 tornado or a really bad hurricane tore through. Further out, the damage will be less, roofs ripped off, miscellaneous damage here and there, to broken windows, to ultimately no damage. The ring outside that is it's a good representation of what's going to catch on fire and who's going to get serious burns. So the gray ring, you can consider that guaranteed fatalities, and beyond that, almost guaranteed serious casualties. Of course, there's going to be exceptions in both. Not everybody's going to be hurt or killed, but you are going to have a lot of serious death or injuries, and you're basically going to be playing roulette in those areas. As far as distribution of the warhead drops, this is just a rough estimation. I don't know what the actual plans are, but this is kind of what the planners do. They spread out the nature of the blasts over the area. They found that it's more efficient to use multiple warheads to get the same effect that a much larger warhead, like a single City Buster 900 megaton warhead, could do. And in this case, for this scenario, I chose 300 megaton warheads because based on intelligence, that appears to be what Russia and China have deployed the most of, and the United States as well. It just seems to be a number that works for everybody. So that's what I chose in this situation. And this last final dot over on the far right in the Inland Empire should be roughly over March Air Reserve Base. That's an Air Force base. What it represents is a military base in everybody's hometown, or if you have one near your hometown. This was a bomber base during the Cold War. Now it houses refueling aircraft and cargo planes. It would be a very important stopover in any war on the Pacific. So if you're nuking things, military bases, why not hit this? So even though you think you might be safe away from the population centers in like a traditional LA, in the Inland Empire, you're not going to be safe necessarily. You still have a huge agglomeration of people in there now. It's been all built up pretty much. And you have an Air Force base. The proximity problem to military bases only gets worse as we shift over to Las Vegas. I chose Las Vegas for my book Late for Doomsday 2 because the prequel takes place in the Mojave Desert and it's convenient for the plot. But anyhow, on the upper right, you see Nellis Air Force Base. It's not I wouldn't call it a strategic Air Force base. It's more of a training and development facility than anything else. But if there were a war in the Pacific, it would be an important stopover for deploying forces. And for future development of our Air Force, it is a training facility, so why not make it harder for pilots to train there? Plus, if you're nuking population centers anyway, it doesn't take away anything from destruction in the Las Vegas area. Here you can see this big green ring. That's the ionizing radiation. The red circle just beyond that is going to be the destructive force, again, enough to totally destroy anything with the most hardened structures. They don't have any nuclear missiles there. They don't store nuclear weapons there anymore. But everything is going to be wiped clean down to the foundation. The runways are going to be radioactive. So that base is no longer mission capable. In addition, you're going to have the surrounding areas just completely blown away. And you're probably going to have some of the blast wave reflecting off the mountain back into the city, intensifying the effect. I also want to take this moment to point out that not every town that has an airport with a long runway is a target for being nuked because of their airport. We don't disperse bombers to regional airports anymore. It's a 1960s thing. We don't do that. So just delete that from your head. Here we have the Las Vegas downtown strip area nukes. In the book, I put the nuke in between both to get 2 for 1. Again, wasn't expecting the Chinese to have that many nuclear weapons, so I guess they're economizing here. But in this case, you lose the downtown area, you lose the tourist corridor. If any of the hotels survive, they have been reduced to skeletons. I mean, there's people probably blown out. If you want to read a horrifying description of it, get my book. But it still shows destruction happening in the city as well. Okay, so everything in that gray dot, whether it's a hotel casino or it's somebody's house, is probably not going to be standing anymore. And even as you get beyond that, even down to 1 PSI, you're going to have the windows blown in. And if there's going to be fallout around, you don't want to lose your windows. Looking at that orange outer ring, again, that's third-degree burns here, but that's probably a good representation of what's actually going to be catching on fire and your maximum destruction by fire over the hours to come. It's also probably a good representation of traumatic injuries that are ultimately not going to be survivable. Again, nuclear war is going to hurt so many people. In this case, you can see in just a very conservative count of the casualties. It's probably going to be up to double that amount depending on how many tourists are in town. There are going to be so many casualties that medical care will be absolutely overwhelmed. And again, they're going to be operating in primitive circumstances. They are not going to be using all the latest, greatest techniques to save people from radiation sickness or using their trauma centers to get the 2x4 that blew through little Timmy's chest out. Okay, if you have a serious injury, you better hope that you have a nurse in the family or a doctor living next door who can keep you alive, because when you go to the hospital, if you can get any medical care at all, it is probably going to be the most minimal. And how long are they going to be able to keep this up? How long are the supplies going to be able to last? Probably not at all. In reality, you're probably going to have medical care for 24 to 48, maybe 72 hours until the doctors and nurses are too exhausted to carry on. The entire system collapses about the time that any supplies have totally run out as well. And remember, if the entire country gets nuked, there's no evacuation somewhere else. I guarantee you people who can travel will move to unaffected regions to get care and overwhelm those places as well. Now we travel to Colorado Springs, which if you live in Colorado Springs, I'm sorry, but you are going to die in a nuclear war. It's just inevitable. You have too many targets there, and you are not going to make it. NORAD is a big underground bunker there at the Cheyenne Mountain Complex that's going to require the really large 800 kiloton nuclear weapons to detonate at ground level to destroy the bunker and really severely or completely wipe out our ability to respond to nuclear attack. So that means all of Colorado Springs is going to suffer from some pretty intense fallout, and the regions downwind going across the prairie, which we'll switch back to here in a bit. As you can see, lots of targets around. The Air Force Academy, NORAD, Peterson, Shriver. Shriver is where the GPS is controlled at. Large Army base there at Fort Carson. Colorado Springs is a target-rich environment, and it's a very good representation of large, dangerous places to live next to in an urban area. Denver's less dangerous because it only really has Buckley Space Force Base, but it also has a large population. Denver's a big city, so it's going to be a counter-value target. Colorado Springs is both. I think Colorado Springs is probably the most dangerous and the worst nuclear whipping boy in the country outside of Washington, D.C. Here's my take on what the strikes would look like on the Colorado Springs area. You have NORAD on the lower left, working counterclockwise Fort Carson. Then you have Peterson, and you have Shriver going back to the city of the metro area, and above that you have the Air Force Base. Again, I don't know if the Air Force Base is actually going to be nuked, but I kind of went for it. It's going to be very bad. Okay? You're going to have a fallout from NORAD and potentially fallout from surface bursts at other locations, although I don't know if they're going to do that. Of course, you want to destroy the military targets. Being in the center of the country, you can't really do it with cruise missiles. I guess you could smuggle some in, but that's not really going to work. And you may also just want to kill a lot of the people who either work at these bases or support the population there. So you kill the people in the city, you kill a bunch of Americans, you try and ruin any resolve to continue the war, and you hurt the military ability. I won't go to Washington, D.C. because you can kind of assume a lot of the targets there, but these are things that you need to be looking for in your area. I hope this gave you a better understanding of what potential targets are and what to look for in your area, and the considerations you need to make when thinking if your house is going to be nuked or not. So again, live away from the military bases, live away from, I guess, any major ports, especially if you're on the West Coast, and live towards the fringes of large metro areas or well outside them. But again, most major cities are not going to be nuked in a way to produce a lot of fallout. The only reasons you need to worry about that is if you're living near some sort of potential nuclear missile silo. The nuclear missile bases, or submarine nuclear missile bases, in Kings Bay, Georgia, or Bangor, Washington, or the military bunkers like Colorado Springs, or Omaha, or Washington, D.C., for everybody else, especially to my very rural readers, unless you're in the Midwest and downwind of those missile silos, you're going to be okay. Your house is probably not going to be flattened, and any radiation threat you face from fallout is probably going to be slight. Now, if you like these videos and want them to get better and like my work and want me to do more of it, I really ask that you read some of my books. You don't need to make any donations. Just read my works and support me that way. And will learn much, not only from my nonfiction Nuclear Survival in the Suburbs, but from these fictional books as well. Again, they are very well researched to be as realistic as possible, given the constraints of fiction. I like to think that they are more realistic than any other nuclear war book out there, with the exception of Pulling Through by Dean Ng. I do have a link to that on my website, and we do have a whole webpage full of free nuclear survival information in one place. Visit my website at www.dawnshift.com. The nuclear page is /nuke. Thanks.